You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis podcast. Cannabis extracts, or dabs, have become a huge part of the cannabis industry, with more and more people choosing extracts over cannabis flower, largely because of the rise in popularity of vape pens that allow people to discreetly vaporize cannabis extracts almost anywhere unnoticed. Additionally, most product manufacturers use cannabis extracts in some form or another when they're making things like tinctures and topicals or infused foods, because it's far easier to standardize the potency and ensure the cannabinoids are evenly distributed in a product when you use an extract rather than the herb itself, which makes perfect sense. But what do you really know about cannabis extraction? How do these different cannabis extraction methods differ? And how are cannabis extracts refined? And more importantly, are these products safe? Join us as we take a deep dive into the world of cannabis extraction and refinement. The world of cannabis extraction can be very exciting, intellectually stimulating, a little mysterious, and sometimes even seductive. There are many different ways to extract chemical compounds from cannabis. Beyond extraction, there are a number of different processes that might take place after the extraction to clean the extract up, refine it, or manipulate the chemistry in some way. And this all leads to a wide spectrum of products and product consistencies ranging from hash to rosin, butter, batter, wax, pull and snap, shatter, sauce, diamonds, isolate, and everything in between. In this episode, we'll be taking a critical look at the world of cannabis extraction and processing to unravel a basic understanding about the different ways that cannabis extracts are made, how these processes may affect the chemistry of a final product, and what questions consumers should be asking about their favorite extracts. And to guide our curious quest, we'll be focusing on several key questions. 1. What are the primary ways that cannabis extracts are made? Number 2. Why are there so many different types of cannabis extracts, and how do they differ? And 3. Are cannabis extracts safe? So without further ado, let's get started. There are several primary ways that most extractors use to pull chemicals out of the cannabis plant. Some of the oldest and simplest forms of cannabis extraction involve simply sifting the cannabis plant over screens to collect the resinous trichomes that hold most of the cannabinoids and terpenoids. This method of dry sifting produces a product that many refer to as keef. It's a powdery consistency and can be pressed together to form hash. Contrary to dry sifting, there is also wet sifting, which produces a product commonly referred to as bubble hash or water hash.
Anyone that's ever seen a cannabis plant, you've seen that it's got this frost on it. Some people like to call it the crystals. Some people call it the THC, even though that's not really accurate. What it actually is called Glandular Trichomes.
This is Marcus Bubbleman Richardson, who was largely responsible for popularizing bubble hash in the late 1990s and early 2000s.
These little crystals are little mushroom-like creatures. They have a stalk and they have a little head on the end of them. Inside that head is where the magic happens with cannabinoids and terpenes. And so bubble hash is really just those heads broken off. And I'll give you a little explanation. So inside that head, we have things called organelles, 2 of them on either side. You have a plastid and a vacuole. Plastids produce phenols, which are alcohols. And the vacuoles produce hydrocarbons, which are terpenes. So these hydrocarbons and phenols push up into the upper membrane of this little globe, and they basically start synthesizing CBGA with the help of UVB and probably some other things that we're not even aware of at this point in time. So all of the compounds, all of the cannabinoids, which is THCA, CBDA, CBGA, there's a lot of them. You can look them up. as well as the entire terpene profile. And there's upwards of 180 of those, from humulene to terpenoline to alpha pinene to myrcene and beta caryophyllene, which is the one that drug dogs were always tested in because it's often a dominant terpene, very peppery, and very, very noticeable to a dog's nose. So those little heads are where the magic occurs, where the medicine is produced. So that wax membrane holds it all in place. Bubble hash is basically, and you can do this at home. You could take a little bud, you could put it in a glass of water with an ice cube or two. You can kind of shake it up, break that bud up, shake it all up. And what'll happen is the little resin glands will become very brittle in the cold. That wax makes them very brittle. It'll break off right at the neck where the head sits at, which is the most easily broken area. It'll break off, and due to the density of the trichome head and the fact that it's oil filled, it's still affected by gravity and water, and that's really the magic of bubble hash. So those little glandular trichome heads sink in the water while everything else stays afloat, and then we just pull micron screen bags accordingly. First one pulls out all the flour, the second one pulls out, some contaminant, and then you start getting these different gland heads at different micron diameters. So that's really what bubble hash is. It's the medicinal components that are, produced by the plant in these glandular trichomes.
Another mechanical way to extract chemicals from cannabis involves squeezing the plant material or a cannabis extract and collecting the resins that ooze out of the squeeze. This is usually done under heat so that the resins melt and pour out during the pressing so that they can be easily collected. This method of squeezing or pressing cannabis under heat to collect its resins is called rosin production. Now, beyond the mechanical methods of extraction, there are chemical methods which utilize various types of solvents to grab the fraction of the cannabis plant that's desired, or in some cases, to grab the fractions that aren't desired and to remove them. Of course, everyone seems to have a different definition of what's desirable, what extraction methods are best, but we'll come back to that later. The simplest form of solvent extraction is probably the use of food lipids like butters or plant oils, which can be used to extract the resins from the cannabis flower before using the infused lipid in a recipe. Think about like cannabis-infused butters, for instance. Because cannabinoids and terpenes are lipophilic, or oil-loving, they mix well with other oils and fats, and this plays into the chemistry involved in the use of other solvents, which we'll talk about later. Beyond food lipids, there are a variety of different chemical solvents that can be used to extract cannabinoids, terpenoids, and all sorts of other plant compounds. Last year I connected with Dr. Wyeth Callaway, an organic chemist working on cannabis extraction method development. During the conversation, he described the primary differences between extraction methods that are commonly used in the cannabis industry.
Cannabis extracts, let's start with the crazy days when people were taking glass tubes, filling them with either nugs or, cannabinoid-rich trim and blasting them through with these cans of butane. And so the butane will pick up the cannabinoids and the terpenes, and out at the end of this glass tube comes this mucky stuff, brown stuff, which they're going to purge the butane out and get a cannabis concentrate. So that's hydrocarbon. Nowadays, you have these closed-looped extractors, which simply means that the cannabis is loaded into these tanks. And what will happen is hydrocarbon, butane, propane mixes, isobutane, everyone sort of has their recipe, will be flushed through these tubes containing, the biomass. And imagine this whole apparatus is stainless steel. It can tolerate very high pressure. And as you flush the solvent through each of these tubes, you're going to eventually bring it over to something called a honey pot. And before you do that, you're going to purge the butane inside the system, and it's going to go back into this moving reservoir. So the butane is, or the hydrocarbon is recycled. People really like it because you can do the extraction in low temperatures, and you can help eliminate a lot of the waxes that are in the plants and get a lighter, very good-looking terpy crude. And all you have to purge is hydrocarbons, which are really low boiling. So you can do these in warm vacuum ovens, get rid of all the hydrocarbon, and you can use it as a raw concentrate, or it can go on further to further processing, be that distillation or some kind of winterization, or make diamonds out of this extract. The next method, it would be supercritical CO2. Roughly speaking, you're going to pressurize CO2 gas inside of it's also a closed stainless steel extractor. You're going to load your biomass again in these socks and inside a tube, and you're going to pressurize the CO2 until it's a liquid. Because you may or may not know, but in normal conditions, dry ice doesn't become a liquid. As it melts, it becomes immediately a gas. So the CO2 is roughly a decent polarity to pull cannabinoids. There's a big debate on conditions and whether you use cold solvents or not. I can't really speak to that, but the extracts tend to have more wax in them. If you don't remove the terpenes, the process of getting the material ready for the CO2 extraction will destroy the terpene profile. Advantage of this, it's eco-friendly. You're only using CO2, and as opposed to hydrocarbon, where you have to do really good purge to get rid of all the butane and propane, isobutane. On the other hand, so we have more waxes. Unfortunately, the machines are fairly slow, and you have to operate at very high pressure. But you will see people still using these. In fact, in hemp, it's one of the interesting ways to go, because it's can be operated under what's called the Type 6 license in California without volatile solvents. Last but not least, and this has become sort of the giant of the industry, is ethanol extraction. Ethanol is not a very selective solvent at room temperature, and it'll pick up more plant matter, chlorophyll, waxes, probably even some of these fatty acids, and you get a really, really soupy, hard to deal with mixture when it's time to cool it down and filter it, and just try to get the cannabinoids alone. We had to use carbon scrubbing to get out the chlorophyll, a lot of processing with ethanol. Now what people figured out was, hey, well, why don't we do this ethanol at a very, very cold temperature, at the temperature you're going to do the so-called filtration winterization step. Let's just go ahead and skip a step and do the extraction at those temperatures. So the advantage of ethanol is you can do a lot of it very quickly. Disadvantage, you have to remove a lot of solvent very quickly. Use a lot of solvent to do these extracts. And you can also have difficulties with maintaining terpene profiles. In the past, a lot of people have gotten around this by adding plant-derived terpenes. So, with the goal just being to make as much drugs as possible. So ethanol throughput and I would say ease of use of the equipment. The whole process is fairly easy to put under stainless steel, make one continuous process. So, there you have it. I would say the majority of large producers are going to ethanol.
But how does someone decide what extraction method to use?
So the first question that everyone has to ask themselves is, what do you want to make?
Yeah.
Your end product is really important. And a really quick and easy way to simplify that is, does your final product need to have the original terpene and flavor profile from the plant? Yes or no?
This is Murri, a cannabis educator and botanical extraction technologist.
And, a yes to that answer means that you're looking at CO2 or liquid hydrocarbons. If it's a no, then you can look at CO2, liquid hydrocarbons, or potentially ethanol or heptane or, some of these other products. The other question you have to ask yourself is, what type of cannabinoids are you looking for? you need the acid form? Do you need those, crystalline solids? Or are you looking for a decarboxylated product? Because certain extraction methods are also more likely to give you one or the other. And so those two questions will usually shorten your list right away. And so from there, ethanol is one of the best solvents suited for scale currently. And the reason for that is that so much ethanol extraction already exists in other industries. It's considered food safe.
Yeah.
And so there are, regulations and equipment in place that we can just straight up copy and, put into effect for cannabis. However, the boiling temperature for ethanol and, its interactions with water are really problematic, especially depending on the qualities of your inputs. And so you lose terpene content almost no matter what. And you are also at risk for some degradation and some pH issues, extraction of undesirable compounds like sugars. And so there's a lot of things to consider that are going to lead you to, first of all, a decarboxylated product, but also more than likely an isolated product. It's going to be harder for you to have a clean oil that doesn't call for a lot of post-processing and cleanup.
Yeah.
And so, the drawbacks are, definitely very chemical, but the benefit is that if you want to process 5,000 pounds or more per day of raw material, ethanol is your current best option. However, that 5,000 pounds that you extracted that day isn't ready for sale that day.
Right.
It's still in solution, most likely.
It's a big picture.
Exactly. So, there's still more days in that final product production end.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at CO2 is a very complicated product because CO2 is a flexible solvent.
Mm-hmm.
It relies completely on the operator and the equipment having a plan and sticking to it. And so CO2 is capable of being an excellent solvent for terpene extraction. It's also capable of extracting a lot of water and wax and nonsense, just depending on, how that equipment is used and how efficient that process is. A lot of people decarboxylate their material, like you mentioned, to avoid the water issues, which means sacrificing terpene content, which is a bummer because CO2 is capable of doing probably one of the best jobs with terpenes as far as solvent extraction would go. But, it comes generally with the cost of still requiring winterization in ethanol.
Yep.
So I tend to put CO2 and ethanol together because whether you make your crude with ethanol or you make it with CO2, you probably are going to be following the post-processing path. That's the same either way, which would be that winterization and filtration, and then probably, most likely, distillation.
Right. Yeah.
And the exception to not going to distillate is usually still just to be in that raw oil form. So maybe you might not distill, but it's still only available for pens or for, food. It's still not, it's still a limited product as far as what you can do with it.
Yeah.
And so hydrocarbon is a lot more flexible in that regard because while it is a very small input batch size, we're doing, 500 pounds or less per day in the average lab, which is not massive scale. We're not going to feed the world with that. However, I don't have any of that week-long post-processing that follows it up. Mm-hmm. So while I might only get to process 500 pounds that day, I could sell the oil that I made that day the next day. Yeah. Which is, a big difference. And it's something that, we often skip when we look at our production plans is, how many, like we think about how much can this equipment do, per pound, per hour, whatever. But we have to bring it all the way back and say, okay, well, all of this equipment in a straight line is going to take how long from raw material to packaged and for sale?
Exactly.
And hydrocarbon is absolutely the fastest for that. Butane and propane evaporate at very low temperatures, which means we get the acid form, which means I can go to Delta 9. I can distill it. I can make a tincture. I can make edibles, or I can make all of these other things that I can't do as easily or as quickly with CO2 or ethanol.
Yeah.
So that that post-processing flexibility is the primary advantage there. It is, however, combustible.
Yeah.
And so, with ethanol, we have the flammable issue. And with CO2, we have the high pressure issue. With the liquid hydrocarbons, we have both.
Yeah.
So, the risks are significant, and the risks are only mitigated via equipment and safe workspace. There's no safe way to just be careful, and statistically speaking, for everyone who is going to listen to this and think, well, I've been doing it for years. Statistically speaking, the more days you've gotten away with it, the closer you are getting to the day when you won't. It will come. And so, the safety risks are significant because it is combustible in nature.
Yeah.
However, it is a clean extraction method. Butane and propane don't dissolve mold. They can't carry over, water as easily. So the final product, because it's very easy to remove the solvent, and the solvents are food safe, and our exposure to them is generally non-toxic. They're very safe products. Whereas with ethanol, high levels of residual ethanol can certainly be harmful, especially for oral ingestion. And, that high level of water content in a lot of CO2 products can lead to microbial growth. And so we have, some pros and cons both on the processing side as well as for the actual consumer. Because if I need a product that can store for a very long time with limited degradation, a hydrocarbon extracted product probably has a better shelf life than an ethanol extracted product or a CO2 extracted product based on literally just their moisture.
I spoke with Dr. Daniel Hayden from Extractioneering about the chemistry of the extraction process. Extractioneering utilizes a co-solvent process to overcome some unique challenges with typical solvent-based extraction systems. They're best known for their carbonated high cannabinoid and high terpene full-spectrum extracts, and they claim to be one of the first companies to use the term full spectrum to market a cannabis extract.
When I come up to this problem in cannabis, when I got done with academia and government and everything, it's a problem right in front of me. It's a separation problem that needs buffers. And so certain things work better than others. You have CO2. So CO2 doesn't have a hydrocarbon equivalent,
Right.
Although it comes from the industrial gas complex. Impurities could be added to CO2 just like
any
hydrocarbon, right? And so, but you have to bend CO2 in a few different directions. You say, I want a heavier molecule, I want a lighter molecule. In the end, I'll put them back together.
Yeah.
And so Humpty Dumpty got put back together again. It never, as I extract biology in my life and my career, I could not reassemble complexity in the reverse direction.
Yeah.
To any meaningful extent.
Yeah, I mean, that's a common issue in herbalism. I mean, going back to old roots of alchemy, and I don't want to deviate too much because we'll get to this, but this ties into the concept of full spectrum and everything. And this concept that a lot of herbalists have been chasing down for a long time is how do you capture the plant essence in basically a liquid form, essentially. And the most common way is taking all different parts of a plant, extracting it, trying to mix it back together. But to your point, when you do that and you mix things back together, you tend to find that things have changed, regardless of the ways you've tried to control them.
Yeah, cannabis presents the most complicated example of all this. If you want to extract salicylic acid from willow bark, I mean, it's right in front of you. You just remove everything and you get the one water-soluble compound. Yeah. And it brings down your inflammation. It takes your headache away. Yeah. But when you're talking about cannabis, it's incredibly complex, and oxygen and everything affects what's happening there.
Especially with terpenes that are very, very sensitive to oxidation. And
we want that complete resin. You toss everything else out. I'll get my chlorophyll from somewhere else. I'll get my antioxidants from somewhere else. I'll get my proteins and my starch. I don't need this stuff from cannabis. I want a bioavailable cannabis product that I can use in an administrated way, which is a vapor, that works best for my chemistry and evolution species, right? And so what I find throughout all my extraction and scientific knowledge is I've seen things come together and never be able to come apart again based on the chemistry you're using. And I feel a lot of that is happening in cannabis concentrates today.
What Dr. Hayden is describing here is a process called polymerization, where individual molecules start to join together, stick together to form long molecular chains. And this is actually really important because bigger molecules are more challenging for the body to break up and process, and polymerization leads to a lower bioavailability of things like cannabinoids and terpenes. Essentially, if an extraction process ends up leading to polymerization of these molecules, you're essentially losing access to them when they're consumed.
They polymerize with substances on the exterior of the leaf and what's trying to be protected on the interior of a trichome, lock it in place, and then when you go to vaporize it, almost like boiling water with salt in it, you're just getting these strands of glops kind of flying at you, and the THC works just the same. You say like this to the product, it works, but you want all those things individual. So when they vaporize, you want them all individual, and so you can, each once your sensors and everything can get in there, and they can all get into your alveoli and in your bloodstream as individual molecules. It's just that little bit of extra, and it is found in chemistry and understanding. And so there is proprietary parts of it. So we're working a lot with the combination of CO2 and butane. And what we found is that CO2 is the perfect co-solvent. So what it does is it gets into the resin, and all the parts that would polymerize or attach or oxygen would affect the resin. We charge it with a CO2, like you would carbonate a beverage. And then we run the extraction, and with our sequence, we understand that the CO2 keeps it together, and it eschews like the butane in the solvent, and keeps its terpenes and all its complexity folded together. And then when we relax it and let it release, it unfolds and burps and effervesces, and all those CO2 kind of come off all those oxygens and those double bonded areas, and then you can really start to taste all those molecules start to kind of unravel. So in a sense, we protected all the molecules during the extraction. And at the end, there's no wax for them to lock together and to polymerize, and now you're able to pick it up and dab it, and the vapor, you're able to taste kind of each one. And we would hope each one would get into the bloodstream individually and have all the effects it's supposed to have.
Another method that's a bit newer on the scene for cannabis extraction, but that's gaining in popularity, is extraction using tetrafluoroethane, or R134A. This is a chemical most commonly used as a refrigerant, which I know at first might sound a little weird, but this compound, tetrafluoroethane, can be used as an extraction solvent. And supporters of this method usually claim that extraction with R134A can be performed at lower temperatures and lower pressures compared to other extraction systems without needing much, if any, cleanup or post-processing refinement. Very few of the extractors that I've talked to over the past year or so for the podcast had much experience using this refrigerant as an extraction solvent, so we'll come back to this method in another interview or in a behind-the-scenes episode to talk more about it. Don't worry, this isn't an ad. I just wanted to insert a brief intermission here to give you a chance to take a break if you need to. We're halfway in, we've got 30 minutes to go. If you need to pause and come back later to finish, this is a really good stopping point. Otherwise, I'll catch you back in the episode in a few seconds. Take it easy. So earlier I listed some of the many names of different types of cannabis extracts or concentrates. But what determines the difference between all of these products? Like, what sets a wax apart from a shatter, apart from a sauce versus butter, batter, or pull and snap?
For a lot of cannabinoids, the acid form and the decarboxylated form of that cannabinoid have different physical states. So, for example, THCA is, a solid, colorless, crystalline product at room temperature, whereas, delta-9 THC is, a colorless liquid at room temperature. And so that's a big difference in consistency. So if my concentrate is mostly THC, Delta 9, I'm going to get sticky liquid because Delta 9 is a sticky liquid. But if I've got mostly THCA, I am going to have a primarily dry solid. And so, that first differentiation in ratio of, THC versus THCA, or, CBD versus, THC, makes a big difference in, just the potential consistency that I've got in front of me, especially because, I don't want to say decarboxylation can't be reversed, but generally we're not going back from that. So once we have crossed into that decarboxylated state, once I've got CBD, I've got a solid. Once I've got Delta 9, I've got a liquid. And so the hydrocarbon extraction process allows us to play with that texture a little bit more, because we can start with a dry product and go liquid or not. Yeah. So that already makes a big difference. It's just the dominant compound in any given solution is going to dictate, the structure that it takes on. Then from there, we have, the other minor groups that are involved. Now, hydrocarbon extraction is also excellent for terpene extraction because it happens at low temperature, so we don't destroy them, and they're soluble, in butane and propane, so we're able to capture a lot of them. We also have the added benefit through hydrocarbon extraction of being able to extract wet or fresh frozen material, because it doesn't take on water content in the same way that 5,000 psi worth of CO2 or any given amount of ethanol will. So we have, the potential to not only extract more terpenes because they're compatible solvents, but also because we can capture terpenes from the plant material before it has dried out, before those have changed, before those have evaporated. And so that terpene content is mostly liquid. Some terpenes are solid at room temperature, but mostly we're dealing with liquids. And so the amount of terpene content in any given hydrocarbon extracted product has a huge impact on that liquid versus solid situation, because those terpenes can dissolve that solid cannabinoid. Yeah. And so why we might have 90%, solid THCA cannabinoid content, we might still have something that looks half liquidy, because those terpenes can actually dissolve quite a bit of it and keep it in solution. So, that recipe gives us a lot of options. And that's just based on what it contains, regardless of what I might do to it. If I just pour it out of my extractor and here it is. Then from there, because we have that acid form, because we have some of these solids, we have the potential for crystallization. Or, in the opposite route, we have the potential for, an emulsified or homogenized product. And so, shatter, wax, butter, those kinds of things are generally homogeneous products. Shatter is everything mixed up and, solid and flat, whereas the butter and the wax is everything whipped up and actually aerated. But in either case, basically the same original content, which is way more THCA than that liquid terpene content, which allows it to be, dry rather than wet. And then from there, it's just, how we play with it. It's at that point, it's kind of, how do you take your eggs?
Once an extract is made, it usually is not ready for retail quite yet. Most extracts go through various forms of cannabis refinement. The most common form of refinement is winterization, where an extract is cooled so that heavy fats and waxes will precipitate out of solution, and then that solution is usually poured over a filter where those heavier components are captured and the resulting extract comes out more pure. But there are other forms of refinement, like distillation, and a controversial process called CRC.
Like anything new in cannabis, CRC comes with its own made-up name that people in the cannabis industry developed to use for its specific application within cannabis. So it stands for color remediation, column, or cartridge, generally. And that color remediation part of the phrase is the important part, because that's where everyone gets really hung up. And I say everyone because I mean everyone. The scientific community is going to criticize color as a remediation target, and the the layman is going to criticize that as well, because it's not a very clear, oh, that's a good pun, right? It's not a very, it doesn't help explain what it is. It just implies remediation, and remediation is a word that we don't like as consumers. We don't like hearing that because it implies that something was wrong to begin with. The motivations behind it are often what causes a lot of the scrutiny, in the same way that everyone was very critical of distillate for a very long time, and even still today, to be honest, because it implies that we're taking something that isn't good as is, and we're making it look better without actually being better, is kind of the real frustration that people have, is that if all we've done is change the appearance, then that's not quite a good enough improvement. However, changing the appearance can't happen without also changing the product in some way. But what people mean by that is to remove some of the most well-known compounds that are accompanied by pretty common colors. And so the first category of that is going to be, things like anthocyanins, xanthophylls, tannins, a lot of these like plant metabolites, these compounds within the plant that are not the oh no-nos like chlorophyll that we just all agree like green is bad, brown is bad. Some of these others put you in the like honey color, the copper color, the bright reds, the deep red, somewhat pale pink sometimes, Then you have things like carotene where you get that like bright orange. And so these are a lot of compounds that we know are in cannabis, we know are in other plants. And so we know about these compounds when we isolate them from other plants or when we use them within other plants. And with cannabis, we have all of these compounds that we want to associate this really important value to. Like these are the active ingredients, right? Because they're either psychoactive or relevant to your experience in one way or another. So we've picked like certain terpenes that we think are good, we haven't made a good list of terpenes that don't play a relevant role or that might be bad. But then we've looked at things like canaflavin or like certain flavonoids, certain individual compounds, but we really pick and choose off of that board based on the evolution of our research and the demands of, consumers and kind of just the trends in the way that we consume these products too, And so in that way, trying to remediate one or more of those compounds can give you wildly different results. So just removing anything that happens to reflect the color red might not have a very significant impact on the way your product tastes. But if you remove everything that reflects the color yellow, it will for sure, because you've got some compounds in there that are yellow that have a notable flavor. And these are flavors even more so than like terpenes or smells, right? So these are things that contribute to that like mouthfeel, to what you experience on the exhale. And those are really interesting compounds because those tend to be what we look at when we're trying to capture like the experience of smoking the joint in a dab, right? Some of those compounds don't translate over, either because we didn't extract them or we degraded them in the process or we filtered them out one way or another. So when people look at CRC, there's not one compound that we're saying is being removed. It's not like saying pesticide remediation where we're saying there's no pesticides now and everyone feels good about that. It's not like saying de-waxing where we're saying now there's not waxes and so everyone feels good about that. We're saying a big mystery category that we have not identified nor quantified has been removed, maybe, probably. Can't be proven because we can't identify or quantify these compounds. And then what you end up with as a consumer is just a visual change that represents any number of like actual physical changes in terms of what molecules were removed. And so when you look at a clear product, that is going to indicate generally more isolation, not a single isolate necessarily, but a higher purity of whatever compounds are there. And the whatever part is important, right? Because waxes can be white and chalky and dry. And that can be easily mistaken for ground up THCA powder, which appears chalky and dry, but is in fact a denser, more crystalline structure, right? And so that's the difference between looking at sugar versus flour. Because if I take sugar and I grind it up into powdered sugar, now I'm looking at powdered sugar and flour, and it's a little harder to tell the two apart. You can, but you got to get in there, right? You got to be familiar with that product already. And so for the average consumer, a scoop of dry wax is going to look almost the same as a scoop of dry THCA. However, the experience is going to be wildly different. So this particular method of this particular process is column based, which is an important feature of it, especially from that chemistry perspective, because it is all a variation of chromatography, generally a solid phase chromatography. And so the way that you apply that is really important. And we've already established that the goal of the process is unclear. Which within traditional chromatography would not really be acceptable. All chromatography is about, putting a sample in and separating it into major components. And so when it's something like pesticides, we're going to use a column, and we're going to use a media that is very appropriate based on its lack of compatibility with the solvent and its, affinity to those particular pesticides, to keep the pesticides in the column moving slowly and keep everything else in the solvent moving quickly. And so we choose our solid phase, or that base, that media, the powder, based on what we want to remove. And then similarly, we also choose a solvent based on what's going to work really well with that solid phase pairing. And so, that whole chromatography theory is a very relationship-oriented theory. It is the media versus the solvent plus the oil. How do we do it? And the CRC approach, we've already chosen our solvent. We're keeping it in the butane-propane combination we already extracted with. So instead of having that variable that we choose with intention, we just say, here's our solvent, which is fine. Yeah, that's fixed. That's what our liquid phase, our mobile phase is going to be all about. And now we go in and we look at our solid phases, right? And so this is where things get really complicated, because our chromatography media, things like silica, things like alumina, there's a million different kinds. There's like imprinted beads now that are targeted to an individual molecule, right? So that means that there's a different type of media or powder for literally every molecule individually. And then there's the media that are for more than one of those at a time in every shape and size, in, lots of different levels of, purification or quality control. And so the differences in those media are really important based on their industrial applications.
After talking to Murphy for nearly 2 hours about CRC, it became very clear that CRC is not a single thing, even though we often use that phrase as if it refers to a single thing, a single process. But in general, it's just a phrase used to refer to various widely different methods of column chromatography, often with very undefined quality parameters or molecular targets. So far, we've talked about how cannabis extracts are made, but let's change gears a little bit and focus on a different question. Are cannabis extracts, or dabs, safe? The safety of cannabis extracts is kind of complicated. First, there's the issue of contaminants in extracts, which can be unique compared to contaminants in cannabis flower, for instance. Without proper quality controls in place, extracts can be produced that feature any number of contaminants, sometimes in very high concentrations. And these contaminants can be things like leftover solvents, possibly even clays or silica. Sometimes there are chemical byproducts formed during the extraction or the refinement process. And also, the process of concentrating cannabis resins can also concentrate certain contaminants like pesticides or even mycotoxins. Next, there's the problem of additives, which are intentionally added to a cannabis extract for one reason or another, but usually in order to give the extract a particular consistency. Some of the additives you might find in cannabis extracts include things like MCT oil, vitamin E or vitamin E acetate, squalene or squalene, propylene glycol, just to name a few. And there's also an issue primarily affecting black market extracts, and particularly black market shatter, where pine resin is being blended with cannabis extracts to dilute them. And some of the compounds in pine resin are very toxic to the lungs. But let's say you have a clean extract. There's another problem: the hardware. A recent study found that vaporizer pens that feature nickel-chromium hardware can cause intense respiratory symptoms that mimic those seen in the recent vaping epidemic of 2019. Metals, glues, and other compounds can leach into cannabis extracts depending on how they're housed, and that can cause contamination well after the fact. So even if a cannabis extract is clean, if it goes into bad hardware, it can still become contaminated and cause safety problems. Finally, another element that influences the safety of cannabis extracts is the temperature used to vaporize the extract. One study found that when cannabis extracts are heated at high temperatures, there are toxic byproducts like benzene that can be formed from the terpenes as they break down. But assuming that an extract is clean, that it's housed in adequate hardware, and it's heated at lower temperatures, are dabs safe? Well, the truth is that while smoking or vaping a dab once in a while is probably not going to hurt you, we really don't know anything about long-term chronic use of high-potency extracts over, let's say, decades. I mean, really, most people have been exposed to these things for maybe a couple of decades. A lot of the cannabis extracts like butane hash oil or even like bubble hash are really started to hit the scenes in the early 2000s, at least to the level of popularity that we know them now. So they haven't been around long. So there's a lot we don't know. We don't know how, let's say, dabbing every day for decades is going to affect someone's health. In general, it's probably not a good idea to heat plant resins and inhale them in your lungs. But of course, we know that safety and health and wellness is not quite that simple. Now, you might be thinking that one of the benefits to cannabis extracts is that because they're more potent, that would encourage people to actually use less, and maybe they would be safer than smoking something like flower that has all sorts of other chemicals in it. Generally, people are smoking it, not vaporizing it, and that sort of thing. But this doesn't really seem to be what is happening, at least not in large part. Find the dabbing community on Instagram, and you'll be bombarded with videos of people proudly dabbing ungodly amounts of cannabis extract at once. There are challenges where people try to smoke as much as a gram or more of a cannabis extract all at once. And, let's just say a cannabis extract is, to be kind of conservative, let's say 60% or 70% THC. That would be around 700 milligrams per gram. So if you're trying to dab a whole gram, you're essentially taking 700 milligrams of THC at once, not to mention all of the smoke exposure and that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily true that people are smoking less because they've moved on to cannabis extracts. And I can tell you from personal experience in workshops that I've taught and communicating with people that consume cannabis extracts every single day, there are tolerance issues, and a lot of times what I hear from my students that engage in these activities is that once they've switched over to high potency extracts, the level of tolerance that develops makes it very difficult to cut back or switch back to cannabis flower or anything less potent. And so that in and of itself is an issue because it's driving people to consume more and more, which may not be having positive impacts on their bodies in a lot of different ways. I mean, we know that chronic cannabis use does cause changes to the brain. It does change the way the endocannabinoid system functions, and we know the endocannabinoid system is tied into pretty much every other physiological system in our bodies. So, constantly manipulating it may not be the best thing to do. Chronic cannabis use can lead to a downregulation of cannabinoid receptors and endocannabinoid production. It's also possible to develop things like cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, where there's a dysregulation of communication between cannabinoid receptors and other types of receptors like TRPV1 receptors that causes these really interesting physiological changes that makes people feel nauseated. There are negative effects associated from chronic cannabis use that can be experienced, and it is definitely possible that with cannabis extracts, you might experience those effects possibly more easily than you would with flower. We really just don't know, and that's what I really want to emphasize, is that we don't know. Before we wrap up this episode, I really want to directly address a very confusing set of terms related to cannabis extracts. And these include the terms full spectrum, broad spectrum, and whole plant. Perhaps you've noticed these terms on the packaging of a cannabis product. They're especially prevalent in the hemp market for CBD products and CBG products. The problem is that there's no standardized definition for any of these terms, which effectively allows any producer to claim anything they want. Here's a clip from a conversation I had with colleague and herbal scientist Travis Simpson, where I ask him how he feels about the use of these terms.
When I think of full spectrum, I am unfortunately jaded in the sense that it has been taken advantage of by commercial marketing techniques to really articulate product advantages over isolated products. Herbalists have been doing this for a very long time, trying to get the most therapeutic profile out of a plant, which has to do with multiple parts of the plant and then multiple preparations of those different parts of the plant. And within the cannabis and hemp space, the primary processing is done on aerial parts, leaves, some stems, mostly flowers, very infrequently, but sometimes seed will get its way into some of the extracts, and those lead to end concentrates that have a greater chemical diversity. But in the full spectrum conversation, it's very important to identify what spectrum it is that we're referring to.
Yeah, great point, yeah.
Because within a spectrum, that can be on the platform of, say, the whole plant. And we know the cannabis plant has therapeutic properties within the roots, primarily sterol constituents.
Like campesterol, beta-cytosterol, I think is one of them, yeah.
The stilbenoids are a powerful class that is outside of the spectrum of full spectrum oil.
Right.
Because we eliminate root tissue in most modern extraction techniques. So when we talk about full spectrum, it can often refer to either a cannabinoid spectrum, a terpene spectrum, or various degrees of pigments within a concentrate. Most people would agree that a distillate is not a full spectrum, though some people market distillate as a full spectrum cannabinoid profile, being that they are not isolating out any of the individual cannabinoids from that total cannabinoid process.
Full spectrum is a marketing term.
Yeah.
Unless they go out and define certain levels, you'd have to go back to the flower or go back to the biomass and say, I have X% of minor cannabinoids. In my extract, I am going to represent those minor cannabinoids at a certain level, and I'm not going to lose any of them. If you want to talk about flavonoids, if you want to talk about, what else am I thinking? Let's just leave it as flavonoids right now, because that's a buzzword for everybody because of the potential anti-cancer properties of canflavin.
Yep.
You need to show that with analytical work, not just saying, "Oh, my extract is mild." I don't know any testing lab that's testing for flavonoids. There may be. So until there's an accepted definition of what is full spectrum based on what you're starting with, it's a marketing term.
And what about this underlying assumption that full spectrum or whole plant extracts are best? This assumption is primarily based on anecdotal reports and very limited in vitro and in vivo rodent research. To date, there is very little controlled research that has investigated how different components of the cannabis resins contribute to effects. While it's clear that there are modulatory effects happening, how much of the plant's chemical spectrum are needed to drive these effects, we just don't know. The entourage effect, as we commonly talk about it today, is actually a far cry from the intended meaning when it was originally proposed in the late 1990s. I'll close out this section by going back to our conversation with Marcus Richardson. I've really noticed these terms get really popular over the last 5 years, 7 years or so, where they're like really, everyone's really talking about it and blended it into their branding. So what's your perspective on that?
Well, it's pure marketing, and it's come from our conversations on Hash Church. There's absolutely no doubt. You called the timeline to the perfection. Keep in mind it was Skunkman Sam who was the one who discovered the modality, the modulation effects of terpenes. He did it in 2000. He hit up Ed Rosenthal, who wrote the article on myrcene. He hit up Ethan Russo, who created the ensemble effect. He hit me up. It was the first time I had ever smoked pure THCA, and then pure THCA with a single terpene. It was a world of difference. So he opened our eyes up to this modulation. The rest of the world didn't get to become a part of that conversation until I invited him into Hash Church in 2014. That's when we started talking about terpenes. That's when Horatio started making terpenes, and Tony started making terpenes, and Kay from Trichome Technology was doing terpenes, and Sam was opening up this whole conversation. And of course, what people do is they listen, and then they become experts the next day, and they're like, well, terpenes are very important. It has to be full spectrum. It's like, well, that's just not true. And my perfect example is like, listen, the plant is producing a variety of things for us, and whatever works is what we should be able to do for ourselves. We should not try to pigeonhole anyone into, it's all about full spectrum. I listen to Hash Church, and terpenes modulate the effects. You can't not have all the terpenes there. And it's like, let's say, okay, full spectrum. You're all about your full spectrum. Giving full spectrum to a child with Dravet syndrome, it works for the first 6 months, no problem. But something happens in the grow room at one point in time. There's variables that occur. Pressures are lost. Heat and temperatures are lost. Things change. Maybe something happened in the water. The expression changes, and now that medicine no longer works for that patient. I never want full spectrum to go away. But I also will always fight for monomolecular isolates, because what if there are companies that can come in the future, test a full spectrum cultivar that's being used for neurologically sensitive folks like Dravet syndrome and whatnot, and what say we take that cultivar, we deconstruct it, we reconstruct it in a formulated room where everything is exactly what it was every single time. You've got the recipe. It's absolutely beyond consistent, more consistent than the plant itself will ever be able to be. And now you've got the best of both worlds. We didn't have to get rid of one. Humans just want to put up a fence all the time. Oh, monomolecular, no, full spectrum, no, monomolecular, no, broad spectrum. It's like, my God, you guys are fighting for the same plant. Like, you can both have that. Right. These are all tools. It doesn't have to be one or the other, which is the part that I just sometimes want to bang my head, because people, we just want to pick what we want, And that took me a long time, being a water hash and a solvent guy. Now I'm at the point where I, of course, would fight for anyone's right to extract any way that they want. I would fight for the BHO guys and fight for the CO2 guys and fight for the ethanol guys, because we all have our choices and our personal preferences, and I want them all to be available, because what better way to choose when they're all actually available for you to choose, where you can actually make a choice and say, hey, this medicine works for me, or whether it's recreational, it reduces my anxiety and my stress, and it works for me for what I want. So I like the idea of all of these things being made available, and I try not to get myself stuck in a position where I'm choosing what is best. What's best for me is certainly not what is best for you.
Let's summarize what we've learned so far. Cannabis extracts can be produced through a variety of different methods. Solventless extracts can be produced through dry or wet sifting or by pressing cannabis flowers or the trichomes themselves under heat to produce what's called rosin. Extracts can also be made using solvents such as food lipids like butters or vegetable oils, or things like alcohols like ethanol or isopropanol, or other things like supercritical or subcritical carbon dioxide, alkane solvents like butane, propane, hexane, pentane, or even refrigerant like R134A, also known as tetrafluoroethane. How cannabis flower is prepared prior to extraction can dramatically impact the final chemistry of the product. For instance, if cannabis flower is decarboxylated prior to extraction, most terpenes are lost, and this is really common with CO2 extraction. Cannabis extracts often undergo a refinement process, like winterization, distillation, or column chromatography, which is the case with a method colloquially referred to as CRC. The safety of a cannabis extract depends on a number of factors, including contaminants, additives, appropriate hardware, the dose, the temperature if you're vaporizing or smoking, and the frequency of use. It's always best to practice moderation with anything in life, dabs included. For extracts that have been heavily refined or manipulated to produce other chemicals like delta-8 THC from CBD, it's really important to understand the purity of the product to know whether unknown chemicals were formed in the chemical synthesis process. Marketing terms like full spectrum, broad spectrum, or whole plant are not standardized terms in the industry, and every company can use these terms according to their own needs. Additionally, strain names and other labels like indica sativa that might be assigned to the cannabis flower often become irrelevant as the chemistry of the extract becomes significantly manipulated through the extraction and refinement process. Now, this isn't the case for all extracts and all processors. There are some processors that have done a good job at keeping the chemistry of the fractions that they're harvesting intact. But ultimately, what really matters to consumers should be the chemistry of the finished product, what it's housed in, the packaging or the delivery method, and how it's used. When it comes to cannabis extracts, it's important not to get lost in the weeds. And with that, that's our show. I hope you've enjoyed this kickoff to Season 2. I look forward to bringing you more episodes really soon. Keep an eye out for accompanying behind-the-scenes episodes. I'm Jason Wilson. Until next time, stay curious and take it easy. Special thanks to our guests that were so gracious in spending time with me to help build not just this episode, but other episodes throughout this and other seasons. You can find the show notes for this episode at cacpodcast.com/episodes. If you want to learn more about cannabis, check out the Curious About Cannabis book, available on our website at cacpodcast.com/book or on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and other major online book retailers. The Curious About Cannabis workshops are coming soon. Check out cacpodcast.com/events to learn about our 12-week workshop series that gives learners a unique crash course in cannabis and cannabinoid science. Taught by yours truly and featuring guest lectures from previous podcast guests and other industry experts. If you're looking for an intensive scientific introduction to cannabis, you've found it. Visit cacpodcast.com/events to learn more. To support the show and get access to extended and exclusive episodes, early releases, merchandise, and event discounts, and more, visit patreon.com/curiousaboutcannabis. Stay curious and take it easy.
We must work untiringly so that our children are obliged to learn the truth, because it is only through knowledge that we can safely protect them.